Good morning and welcome to the BBA 60-minute webinar on stress testing and scenario analysis with my colleagues from J-Wing, Ben O'Brien, Risk Practice Director, and Peter Auld, Consultant. I do appreciate that some people may have technical difficulties. We've had technical difficulties our side with starting at 11 o'clock, so forgive us for that by way of apologies for that. I just want to reiterate, if you didn't hear at the start of the webinar, that this is an interactive webinar where you can post your questions throughout this presentation with Peter and with Ben by clicking on the orange tab below your screen or your console there. If you do have any technical difficulties, please do let us know and then we'll respond and we'll try and alleviate those as soon as possible. Ben, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Sorry about the technical difficulties we're having there. Hopefully you're all with us now. So, the agenda, what we're going to go through, very briefly, we're going to talk about our own stress testing credentials and why we've been asked to give this webinar today. We're going to start out with a brief introduction on stress testing, just to put us all in the same place. I'm sure we all know what it's all for, but it's useful context. Then we'll talk about 10 steps to success, as in a successful program. We'll go into a little bit more detail on economic response modelling, and my colleague Peter will take us through that. It is worth note that we've got a training course with the BBA on the 18th of November, and I think there's going to be one set up in December as well, where we'll go into more detail around modelling and all of those things, but it'll be useful to go into a little bit more depth. And then finally we'll put stress testing in its place in terms of context, how it fits with other bits and pieces of work that risk departments and finance teams need to do. So, without further ado, we will go on to talk a little bit about our stress testing credentials. So, J-Wing are a team of data scientists, or at least that's the phraseology that is being used currently. Back in the day, we used to be called analysts. But our business is split into three areas: marketing, data management, and risk. And as you can imagine, risk and data management play a fundamental part in stress testing. So what are the sort of areas that we do? Well, we do lots of things around credit risk and portfolio and strategy, but most recently on regulation has become a significant part of everybody's life. Following on from the banking crisis, then there's been a spotlight shone on what we're doing, essentially. And so a number of elements of regulation have come in as a result of that, not least changes to stress testing infrastructures. You could, as a member of the general public, you could ask the question, if all the banks have been doing stress testing for 10 years, then what happened at the end of 2008? So, just move on to talk about our clients, and for one of those clients, we've done full end-to-end stress testing program, essentially, haven't we, Peter? Yeah, I know you led that work, where we started out with the design phase, and then what did we do from there?
That's right. So we worked with one of the largest UK financial organisations, helping them with their concurrent stress test. They were asked to be part of that as part of the new Bank of England regime, which we'll be talking about a bit later in the webinar. So we went in, we helped them with the design of their whole stress testing approach. We helped them with the execution in the retail area of their 2014 and 2015 stress test. We also helped them with their ICAAP in between, and we've been involved this year also in handing over to now a fully fledged stress testing, modelling and execution team within there. So we've taken this institution from stress testing as a piece of project work to actually embedding stress testing as a business as usual function within that organisation.
Excellent, thank you very much, Peter. So I think that sets a good context for our experience here. So I'm just going to move on through the poll questions. But one of the questions that we're sort of interested to talk about is just how much time people spend on stress testing. So some people will be full-time stress testers, some people just dip in and out at the appropriate times. So, we're going to go into talking a little bit about stress testing, but just start out with an introduction and then coming up with 2 or 3 things that are important factors. So Peter, can you just give us a little bit on history, give us a little bit on process, maybe talk a little bit about ICAAP and SREP and what they mean, and then we'll sort of finish off with kind of capital planning buffer, which is sort of, where it all ends up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, Ben, stress testing has been part of the banking framework since the introduction of the Basel regulations, but it's really become a priority after the 2008 crash. Stress testing is used by banks to assess how their particular financial institution's profit dynamics and capital position can vary under a stress environment. Within the UK framework, it's the supervisory review and evaluation process frameworks, the ICAAP, the internal capital adequacy assessment process, there to tongue twister for you, which is the regulatory framework used here for banks to conduct their stress tests and to report back to the regulator. And of course, the reason why they report back to the regulator is not just so that the regulator has an understanding of their financial vulnerabilities, of their risk profile. It's because the regulator wants to impose these capital buffers that you spoke about.
And these are conservative measures designed to protect the consumer?
Absolutely. So the idea is that understanding what the risk profile, what the financial profile of a financial institution would be in a stress event, the regulator can say you need to hold this amount of capital over and above what you would expect to do in order that, frankly, that we can avoid the kind of things that happened in 2007 and 2008.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've had a question come in, Peter, and I thought we could try to answer that question right now.
Let's go for it.
So the question that has been asked, and I think it's a very good one, so I'm going to give it to you to answer. So the question that has been asked for everybody is, how do you attach a likelihood to a forward-looking scenario that has no historical precedent? So I've got some thoughts on it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Your thoughts, Peter.
So I think that's really interesting. I wonder whether the question confuses scenario analysis and scenario setting.
Yeah.
So for most of the ICAAP process, for the concurrent stress test process, the regulator is going to give your financial institution the scenario that it wants you to put your institution through. And when it does that, it will give you the economic variables, consumer spending. It might even flesh it out to a whole international environment.
So they've given you that scenario rather than you having to evaluate what that scenario
exactly.
is.
So they've given you that scenario. However, you might also be asked to look at specific risks for your individual institution. So they can be financial risks, structural risks, organizational risks.
And again, those could be risks that you haven't seen in the past that would be a significant risk to your organisation individually.
Absolutely, Ben. Absolutely. Now, to be fair, I think in that context, the question is very good. How do you determine the risk of an asteroid landing on the City of London? Go and talk to an astronomer, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think we've got stats on that. So from my perspective, then that is a really interesting question. And I wonder, we were talking about, we did an IFRS 9 webinar 2 weeks ago. I think that's a very interesting question from that perspective, in terms of, in stress testing, as you say, you've been given a scenario, you've got to evaluate how your business will perform under that scenario. Under IFRS 9, if you're doing a forward-looking view, potentially there you've got to estimate what you think the likelihood of any of these scenarios coming to pass.
That's true.
One of the things that I've been thinking about there is a lot of the regulators come up with 1 in 20 scenarios, so you could do some play on that in order to understand the overall. Hopefully that's answered the question in a roundabout way.
when we look at what the regulator in the UK wants, we've got a few quotes here from a December 2013 supervisory statement from the PRA, talking about the ICAAP and the SREP framework. So the supervisory statement says, a firm must carry out an ICAAP in accordance with the PRA's ICAAP rules. These include requirements on the firm to undertake a regular assessment of the amounts, types and distributions of capital that it considers adequate to cover the level and nature of the risks to which it is or might be exposed.
That is interesting, isn't it? Because and the final part, expecting firms in the first instance to take responsibility, that really talks to it, doesn't it? So actually, this framework is a framework for organisations themselves to make decisions, and the regulator are obviously sitting in judgment of your own processes.
Absolutely, and it's interesting what the regulator wants to explore with you. So let's look at the second quote. This assessment should cover the major sources of risks to the firm's ability to meet its liabilities as they fall due, and incorporate stress testing and scenario analysis. Now, obviously, that is the financial risks. What would happen? How many of your customers would default on loans in a smaller, more corporate one-to-one framework? How many of your counterparties might default on their loans? But also, increasingly, stress testing is not just about those financial things, it's about the whole infrastructure of your organisation. How are you, as a financial organisation, in your leadership structures, in your IT structures, are you ready to face this kind of stress?
Other types of risks.
Other types of
operational risks and reputational risks that might impact on you. Okay, thank you very much. So, I suppose there's been some interesting movements in stress testing as a result of the financial crisis, and there was a level of grace. So back end of 2008, fall of Lehman Brothers, almost 5 years later was a published paper from the Bank of England talking about a new stress testing regime. Now this new stress testing regime has been applied to the largest 8 organisations in the UK by asset size, but it has brought with it just a general change in stress testing and how the regulators see it and the focus. So I think that this is probably going to seep into all sorts of stress testing things as we go forward. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of the points that they've made. One, concurrency, so trying to get those organisations to provide the stress test at the same time, and common, as in common scenarios. I think those two things do allow the PRA and the regulators to do a particular thing, and that is to compare apples with apples. So everybody's doing it at the same time, so it's not a case of, well, we did it in December and everybody else did it in March, and that was the difference between the two numbers. Everyone's got the same scenario, including the same base scenario, as well as the same stress scenario, so it takes, not all, but much of the elements for apples with pears out, and allows the regulator to make some direct comparisons.
That's right, and what we're seeing increasingly is that the regulator is taking the scenario used in the concurrent stress test and then asking the non-concurrent stress test financial institutions to use that scenario for their ICAAPs.
I noted that myself, so actually so therefore they're building up a bit of an arsenal, even though it's not necessarily then concurrent.
Absolutely.
Of the same sorts of information.
So even if your institution isn't formally in the concurrent stress test, informally you're doing the same thing, even if it's not to the same level of detail. And that's part of the Bank of England's goal, which is to use stress tests not just as individual siloed examinations of institutions, but to have a coherent banking industry view. So one of the things that was promised in this October 2013 paper was that the Bank of England was going to look at the feedbacks and the amplification mechanisms within the whole banking industry in the UK and the wider world framework.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. We've missed out forward-looking, which we'll come back to, but feedbacks and amplification mechanisms is really what this was about, the heart of the heart of the matter, essentially. So, in the paper, the question that we've asked, and a number of people ask, is why did individuals pass all their stress tests and then there was a banking crisis? And the explanation that is postulated in that paper is feedbacks and amplification mechanisms, that the banks were very interrelated, and so you couldn't just do the work on your own and say, if I've passed, I've passed. So I think that's the important point. And we'll tackle that later, but the PRA haven't quite managed that yet. But I think that's their end goal, or one of their end goals, and that's what they can bring back to the party.
So Ben, we skipped over forward-looking. What do the PRA mean by that?
So here's a good question, is forward-looking, and obviously stress tests are by their nature forward-looking. What it's trying to do, I believe, is to say we can't just, back to the question that we were asked earlier, we can't just say if it happened in the past then it might happen in the future, because that's exactly what stress testing is not meant to be doing. It's meant to be coming up with potential scenarios, and I think that the Common Stress Test has done that quite well. So in 2014 it was a UK house price crash, which the wider Europe was concerned about, but that hasn't come to pass. 2015 was something around
the price deflationary scenario. That was actually very interesting because it brought up some specific modelling issues, which we'll talk about later on in the webinar.
Yeah. Okay. You can tell this is a pet subject of mine because we've taken a bit too long over this slide. But just to finish off, there's a public disclosure of results, and that means something for the organisations, but it also means something for the public. So the public get to see, if they're interested, that the banks are safe or not, as the case may be.
Interestingly, when the European Banking Association did a concurrent stress test at the same time as the British one in 2014, some of the Central European banks which failed that test actually then found it very hard to meet their capital adequacy because no one wants to give them capital because they failed the test. So actually public disclosure has some real issues here for institutions, that they want to get their capital plans in place now, not in response to a failed stress test.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it, about what that means. Okay, so I am just going to make one final point because I'm a data person, and the other point that the PRA have done is they're now getting data. So they've asked all the organisations to provide data on these same scenarios, so they're building up a history of how financial organisations can cope with various levels of stress. And I think that's probably what's going to allow them to answer some of those wider questions about feedback and amplification.
And it's a huge amount of data that they are asking for. The structured and unstructured data requests made of the Big 8 and the Big 7 who undertook the 2015 test were, I mean, they took hours and hours of work. But as you said, that lets the Bank of England have a really precise view of the institutions. It's likely that kind of data framework is going to move down the scale in terms of size of the financial institutions. But for the ICAAP requirements, there will be data demands, probably not quite as granular as those demanded of the big ones, but this is coming.
Yeah.
More data permits the Bank of England to do better interpretive work.
Yeah. And they've started to do that by reusing some of the old CST frameworks for other organisations, but as soon as they get asked for more data, then that should complete their picture a bit more. Can you take us through some elements of stress testing, Peter?
Right. So we've looked at a sort of a history of stress testing as to where we've got to now today. The four sort of main elements of stress testing, I would say, are these four that you can see in front of you now. So firstly, the frameworks. The regulatory framework, so are you dealing with the ICAAP framework within the SREP? Are you actually an institution that's part of the concurrent stress test, which is run by the Bank of England at the same time as the European Banking Association and other regulatory bodies around the world? What are your internal planning frameworks for dealing with stress testing? Do you do stress testing as project work, or have you actually moved to a business as usual functional stress testing?
Actually, stress testing, when it was first introduced would have been just purely as a business planning tool.
Absolutely.
Purely discretionary, purely as a business planning tool. But it's been used since then for kind of more direct aims of the regulator.
Absolutely. So your scenario planning originally would be, what do we think is going to happen, and this will help us make our financial plans. But now scenario planning, beyond the scenarios that are given to you by the regulator, your own internal scenarios should be about, what do we think is the worst thing that could happen to us? How will we cope with that?
Excellent. So modelling, I'm going to talk very briefly about modelling, because I know you've got a section on that. So modelling is an essential part of stress testing, but it's not the only part. But for retail portfolios versus commercial portfolios, there's very different methodologies in terms of what the number of cases that you've got lends themselves to different types of analysis. So counterparty risk might choose a certain methodology. In the retail portfolios, you might choose a different methodology. I think we'll be going into that.
Absolutely right.
Just talk to us a little bit about execution and about the interplay between models and overlays or management involvement.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say that you've got these first two things nailed down. You've got your models, whether they're macro models or sort of micro level counterparty models. The next part of the stress test is to execute it. But actually, you probably don't just want to press the button, run your model with the economic scenario and take the results there, because often models cannot cover all the possibilities that might happen to your portfolio.
And this comes back to the interesting question that we got asked.
It comes back to the interesting question, yes.
That actually the new scenario could contain something that the model's never seen before.
So a good stress test doesn't just push the button on the models, it has some form of management involvement, some form of expert knowledge input for overlays onto the results. And these will be overlays onto your default and arrears forecasts, and it will be possibly overlays and management involvement in your financial forecasting, which is driven from your default view of the scenario that you're presented with.
Thank you, Peter. So the final bit is the regulator. All of the work that you do has to be documented clearly, because it's going to be judged by a third party, i.e. the regulator. So they're going to be able to make judgments, be able to make comparisons to your peer group, because of the rich history of data that they're now amassing.
Absolutely, but also the regulator has got work to do themselves. So we've talked about this sort of industry level view of feedbacks and amplifications. The regulators recently, in the past year, said that they want to look at central counterparty risk and things like that. So it's not just that the banks are grinding away hard working through these stress tests, but the regulator is increasingly working with them, using that data to have this coherent UK view of the risks to the banking system.
So they've got a lot of work to do as well.
They've got a lot of work to do as well as you.
They look like a swan above the water.
That's most stress testing departments that I've worked in, Ben.
Okay, so I'm just going to move past the poll questions, but please ask any questions you like. We've had the one so far, but it's been a very interesting one. So please feel free to ask some questions as we go. So what we're now going to go into is the 10 steps to success. So we're just going to break down the stress testing process into 10 steps and kind of talk through what we would do in that. So step number 1, methodology development and refinement. So need to determine an appropriate methodology across different portfolios. So what that means is, we talked about retail portfolios versus, we talked about counterparty risk. Different methodologies need to be applied depending on the type of portfolio and just the volumes of cases that you have. Second thing around the development is something that we talked about as well, blended use of models and management judgment to mitigate key risks, and mitigate the risks around the models. The final bit is a refinement. These things don't stay still. So if we think about the common stress test, the concurrent stress test, we've had 2 of those now. We've had the feedback in December. So taking the feedback into consideration, a big part of the feedback in the 2014 exercise was around model governance. So hopefully a lot of organisations have done what we're asked essentially and taken a step up from that perspective.
So Ben, we have our methodological framework in place, but before we can actually start to run our tests, what do we need to do with our data?
So we need to, firstly, we need to give data to the hungry regulator, and that is something that's called FDSF, Firm-Wide Data Submission Framework. But also we need to produce information for our own purposes. So the depth and breadth of data history is a major factor in developing strong models. In particular, the ability to go back over the last recession is essential, and if you're very lucky, then the ability to go back over 2 recessions would be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
That requires a very rich.
So if you're one of the big high street brands, you probably have some form of default financial history going back possibly even into the early 1990s and the last but 1 recession. If you're a new starter bank, you might not even have been in existence when the 2008 credit crisis happened. So this is the point where you need to sort out your data, and there are ways, if you don't have a good data history, to match it sort of industry standards.
We've worked with a few clients.
We've worked with a few clients doing that.
So proxy data sets in terms of, there are obviously series of how the UK consumers have behaved over time with write-offs, or how UK businesses have performed over time. So these can be used as potentially as proxy series.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, just to move on. Section 3, I talked about ensuring consistency of output, and what that means is making sure that your outputs are consistent with other loss measures. There's a lot of things there. So we do have business planning cycles. So people are forecasting things on probably a yearly basis, maybe even quarterly or biannually. We've already briefly touched on IFRS 9. That's again going to be a forward-looking loss piece of work. These things need to tie in together to make sure that you're telling the same story to the same people in a consistent fashion.
So I've got my structure in place, but do I have the right models for my portfolio? So there are lots of different ways to mathematically model the risk of your portfolio, and they really do come down to the data that you have, the type, the volume, both of your actual of the debtors and of your bads, and also it comes down to the statistical framework that you've got to do that. So make sure that you apply the right model methodologies. In terms of modelling macroeconomic sensitivity, what you want to be looking at is having some form of model that helps you to predict the probability of default in a stress scenario, the exposure in your portfolio and the loss given default. Now, that might be separate models in a macro environment for default, so you forecast what proportion of your book is going to default, and then you sort of run a financial throughput from that. In a smaller framework, you might actually integrate those models together.
So essentially, you're trying to identify drivers of loss and see how those change in the different macroeconomic conditions.
Absolutely.
And for certain counterparty modelling, you might use some different approaches where your numbers are low, kind of some Monte Carlo simulation. I think we're going to go into a bit more detail there, so we'll move on. The execution phase. So we talked a little bit about this. So we've built these models that can work under any economic circumstance. And then we've actually got to evaluate that based on the particular scenarios that we've got available, i.e. in the concurrent world, it's a base scenario of a stress. In an ICAAP, maybe some derivative of that common stress test that the PRA are giving out to you. There's a number of different elements of this, of the execution phase, because this can get... It's a short period of time.
It can be a very short period of time to do quite a bit of work, quite a bit of complicated work. So and now I'm giving an example in a macro retail environment. But you push your button, you've got your model, you put in the economic scenario, it gives you some kind of output on the arrear states, the default states, for your portfolios in the 3 to 5 years that you're asked to forecast. But as we said earlier, you don't want to stop there. What you want to do is you subject matter expert input. You want some sort of portfolio analytical input and management input to say, are those results sensible? Are there things that the models can't capture? So are there sort of low-level issues? For example,
one of the things I was thinking as an example is we were talking about the 1990s recession.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 1990s recession, I wasn't really doing anything then in terms of didn't have a property, wasn't doing all of that sort of stuff. But I've heard about 12% interest rates or 15% interest rates. Now, that's an interesting tool there. That's the sort of thing whereby in recent times, certainly since January 2009, nobody's experienced anything other than a 0.5% interest rate.
This is true. So you might want to mitigate the results here because of perhaps model weaknesses. A great example of this is the 2015 scenario, which had a price deflationary environment. Well, I bet that none of the people listening here have got a default and economic history which they could have modelled in the past on a price deflationary environment. So you might want to put in a management mitigation for that kind of model risk. Can a model built on inflation rates between 1 and 10% handle a minus 1% deflation scenario?
Interesting point. So, for the purposes of time, I think we're going to need to sort of move through that quickly. So, senior management judgment, I think we've actually already covered. This is applying common sense to the results that come out of the model to ensure that they do adequately reflect the risks of the business. There's a couple of other bits and pieces that we need to talk about, which is model oversight. It's essential that models that are being developed have a mechanism for review and challenge.
Absolutely right. And what you also have to realise is that if you're used to building traditional credit scoring models, application behavioural Basel models, a lot of this stress testing uses slightly different statistical approaches. A lot of it is time series modelling, and that is a different perspective. So you need to make sure that you have proper oversight for new methodologies.
Perfect. I'm going to talk about model governance now, because this was the part that was picked up in the last time the regulators talked about the stress testing exercise. So the 2014 stress testing exercise, I think, was generally perceived to have been a success and well executed. There were a couple of points that they made, and one of the main points they made was around model governance.
Absolutely.
So that the sorts of standards that you would have applied for other types of models, IRB models or your own application behavioural scorecard models, were not necessarily applied here. And I think that the lesson learned is to try and...
It seems very clear that the regulator is saying to you, if your Basel models are of the highest standard, if you've got an IRB waiver, if you're doing that level of documentation on all your other models, actually your stress testing models need to meet that requirement in the governance.
Excellent. Okay. The final point in any model is a monitoring framework. Now, I think that stress testing is an interesting mechanism in order to monitor. It's quite difficult. It carries with it some of its challenges because those the scenarios that are presented to you. I think that it's important to understand what the modelling you propose to do, and to take potentially a view to look at an annual validation approach. It's all about continuous improvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm just going to move quickly past the polling questions, but as I say, please feel free to ask us any sort of specific questions. All of the questions are anonymised, and so we won't be bringing your institution into the question, so please feel free to ask. I'm now going to pass over to Peter to give us a little bit more in the classroom about modelling for stress testing.
Thanks, Ben. As we've discussed already, there is no one-size-fits-all answer for modelling for a stress test. You want to be really thinking about using different approaches for different portfolios, and indeed the larger institutions with a retail and a commercial side will probably be using different modelling methodologies for different environments. Large retail portfolios tend to use macro-level economic response models. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your portfolio over time, and you're going to look at the emergence of default and arrears behaviour in response to the economic environment at that time. Now, of course, as I've said before, there are specific modelling issues there with doing a time series model. There are all kinds of things to do with stationarity of data and all those complicated things that the statisticians love to get into. But these are key critical issues for any institution to cover. For a smaller portfolio, where you're looking at perhaps specific counterparty risks and relationships, you might want to use a different methodology. For example, one very favourite methodology is called Monte Carlo modelling. Now, that isn't taking your entire bank's balance sheet over to the casino and wagering it on number 7 on the roulette wheel. Actually means something different. We'll talk about that shortly. But let's move on.
More numbers, more than 7.
There are more than 7 numbers. Yes. Let's move on to talk about ERM modelling, or economic response modelling. Increasingly these days, what financial institutions are doing in their time series modelling for stress testing is using specific regression techniques to separate out the vintage, the maturation, and the other called exogenous effects. Those impacts on their default emergence. What do we mean by vintage, maturation, and exogenous? Well, it's quite simply this. The vintage effect is, were there any particular differences in risk based on when the business was actually written?
So that could be pre or post fall of Lehman Brothers.
For example, pre or post fall of Lehman Brothers. Even making scorecard adjustments, cut-off adjustments, it's going to change what an individual cohort's underlying risk is. The maturation is how does your risk mature? Have you got a fixed-term product? How long is the product? Are you offering a line of credit product? All those things have different maturation profiles.
And if you did an interest-only period for a certain point in time, then that might also affect your overall maturation.
Absolutely. And then exogenous, literally meaning everything else, isn't just the economic environment. So it could be things like specific lending control effects inside your institution. We've seen when institutions have changed their debt management input criteria, that has a real effect on the default rates of their portfolio.
So essentially, this talks to that forward-looking element.
Absolutely.
So this particular methodology talks to forward-looking very well.
Absolutely, because here's the thing: if you can decompose the vintage effects, the maturation, and the exogenous, you can then apply that to your future lending cohorts. If you know that you're going to have a scorecard cut-off change, you can apply that as a vintage adjustment. You can even talk about what you would do as an institution in response to the events of the scenario.
So it strikes me that forward-looking element, this sort of framework, is going to be useful within IFRS 9 as well.
Absolutely. Those of you on the webinar who are involved in IFRS 9 work as well will see that we're talking about that in that kind of thing as well, that there are real synergies between using a good forecasting engine for stress testing work and for your IFRS 9 work.
Makes sense. I'm going to move on Monte Carlo modelling, because you did go through that, and you'll find out that even if you put it on all of the numbers, then the number 0 came up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to mess you up.
Okay, so Monte Carlo modelling.
Let's move on from Monte Carlo modelling, just because of the time. I'd like to sort of get to the end of it. We've kind of done a bit on that. If you want more, then the stress testing course on the 18th of November.
We'll be covering that.
We'll cover that in much more detail. The final point in the last couple of minutes of the webinar is just to sort of put stress testing into context. So we have talked a bit about decomposing arrears patterns into the maturity aspect, the vintage quality, and then this exogenous impact. So here's how our view about how that might look. So you've got the exogenous impact, and then you're building economic response models that feed into that. This is an overall schema of how it looks. On the left-hand side, you've got vintage delinquency data or dynamic delinquency data, which breaks that up into these 3 components. Then, looking at the exogenous components, it says, what impact does the macroeconomic environment have? And that's where the regulators, CST 2015, or the scenario that they put to you, actually puts that into place. At the top, we've got the forward-looking macroeconomic and new business assumptions. So they're not just the assumptions from the regulator, but they're assumptions about your own business. And this is where it's essential that everything ties together. Your new business assumptions are important from a forecasting perspective. Without new business, then everybody's business looks like it's diminishing. So that's a very important factor. It's important that your stress testing framework and your forecasting framework, and I would postulate that your IFRS 9 framework uses similar tools, similar processes to ensure consistency across all of the risk measures that you are using within your organisation and that you're also speaking to the regulators about.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, look, we are nearing the end of our presentation, and there are about 150 of you listening to us at the moment. So now is the time to get your questions into us on stress testing. While you're typing those and passing them on to us, Ben, can I ask you, what do you think are the key steps for any institution doing stress testing to moving from a stress testing as a piece of project work to stress testing as a business as usual function? And why do you think it's important to do stress testing as a BAU function?
Okay, well, I think moving it to a BAU function, there's one very simple thing that I can say on that, is that it's not just something, it's not got any seasonality, it's not something you do in January and February and then you forget about for the rest of the year. And that's the important thing about putting it making it BAU. If we think about the concurrent stress testing regime, then that is done in the months of April, May and June. If you pick up your pen on the 30th of May and put it down on the 30th of June, then there's only one thing that's certain, which is that's not really going to work.
You're right.
So the important part, and where we've talked about model governance, the important part is that there is the execution phase where everything is occurring, but all of the processes need to have been put in place before that point. So the models need to have gone through governance. People need to have been thinking about what the implications of these are, and it's actually an all-round process, an all-year-round process.
Great. And the leading institutions doing stress testing as BAU aren't just doing the stress tests for their ICAAP and the CST is their part of it. They're actually thinking up scenarios as an ongoing process. They're integrating into their corporate plans. They're looking at all different sort of things that could happen to their institution, and providing not just sort of feedback for the regulator, but they're inputting into the executive governance of their institution, having a varied view as to what the possibilities are for their institution.
Marvellous. Well, I'm going to move through the final question, and it just remains for me to thank you for joining. Apologise for some of the technical difficulties at the beginning, yeah, hopefully we can put the recording of this up, and people who weren't able to make it can listen back into that at a future point in time.
Peter and Ben, do you want to describe in a few bullet points what you'll be discussing, what you'll be unwrapping on the course on the 18th of November, and possibly, because I know that we've only got a few places left on that, the 7th of December. What type of issues are you going to be covering in those?
So what we've tried to do here is produce a very high-level view about what kind of stress testing is. At the actual course, where we've got the full day, we'll go into much more detail. So what we're proposing, we'll have a series of kind of round-table discussions. We've given this one before, Peter, last year. The bit that was really interesting was seeing how people interpret different elements. And so we've got organisations together, and they would all have a discussion about particular elements. So we go into scenario planning, we go into modelling, and different organisations can then ask us different questions about how to tackle those challenges. And in fact, different groups of people can help each other. So a lot of the time we don't actually have to answer the question, because the question that's being posed on the left-hand side of the room, then there's somebody itching to answer it on the right-hand side of the room because they've done this piece of work before. So it's peer-to-peer learning. So it's peer-to-peer learning as well. And if you imagine, what is the best way to build an economic response model? Well, it depends whether you're Peter from Bank A, who deals with commercial entities and has got 500 people in his portfolio, to whether you're John from organisation B, who's got 100,000 cases.
So what we want to try and do is give you the frameworks to do your stress testing, that you know where to dive in from, which board to dive into the pool from.
Yeah, and we're going to actually sort of go down into a reasonable level of detail, talking about how you can actually build these models, how you could iterate around putting management judgments in place, and we bring with them a series of exercises. So here's some materials that we prepared in terms of the history of a particular organisation. All of this stuff is we've made it up essentially some of the numbers, and that gives us a mechanism for actually having some of those debates that you're going to have in real time during the stress testing process within your organisation.
So in good Blue Peter fashion, that you've got here's one I prepared earlier.
Here's a bank that we've broken earlier. Here's now how to fix it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Peter and Ben. And as they've said, 18th of November, dates for your diary, and also 7th of December is the secondary stress testing and scenario planning workshop, which is going to be held at the BBEA. These slides and this webinar will be available on demand, which we will send you directly for those who couldn't attend, and also those people who want to share it with their teams by tomorrow afternoon, and we'll push that out. It would be great to get your feedback on this webinar, and also if you want to ask questions to people, to the presenters, they'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you later on. So thank you very much for your time. I do apologise once again for the technical challenges that we've had, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the workshop. Thank you.